So, good evening. We are here to continue our discussion of the critical area amendments. We have 4 sets of amendments before you this evening. And you all know Amy Sumi from Shannon and Wilson, but this is David Klein, also with Shannon and Wilson. He is our flood hazard expert. So if we have one of the first items we're going to look at is the frequently flooded or flood hazard areas. And so if you have technical questions, he is available for that. So with that, I thought I might just jump in and give you an overview of the sections, and then in the past you've reviewed them by exception, or if you have questions, we can tackle those if that is all right.
Do we have a preference? We've got a lot here, I could see, so exception would be the probably most efficient way to do it.
All right, so as I mentioned, the first section is draft regulations related to frequently flooded and flood hazard areas. It's actually the consolidation of 2 existing chapters. There's a chapter in 1690, it's actually outside of the zoning code, that deals with flood hazards. And then we have Article 19 in Chapter 1855, which is our traditional critical areas chapter. So what I tried to do, and all these folks have been reviewing it, we also have an internal staff review group that's looking at things, but we've tried to break out the standards by type of development and then also by location of development. So there's some geographic characteristics of these areas, and different standards apply in different areas. We also looked at the definitions. We had to consolidate definitions, and that was part 2 of attachment 1 that you received. And then once we'd completed the first draft, we sent it off to John Graves at FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. We participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, and to do so, our standards have to be adequate to satisfy their needs. So we have asked them to take a look and make sure that the standards are adequate to continue our participation there. So with that, I don't know if you two have anything to add, or we'll just wait for questions or concerns. I don't know if you...
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that in addition to the National Flood Insurance Program, the city participates with King County as in regional guidelines for all of the municipalities within King County. So there's some additional language and code restrictions that are associated with King County. So King County has a standard that's higher than the FEMA minimum standard, and so those have also been rolled into and checked and confirmed with this code update. And so if you want to see what they are, we can show you kind of,
right.
It really boils down to one slide here, and it's
Here we go.
If you go to the second or third slide there, so the third slide, this shows the flood insurance rate map for Swamp Creek, and you can see on the left-hand side there's 3 legend areas. We have the flood fringe, that's just gray, and the FEMA floodway, that's gray with a diagonal hatch. So the flood fringe are the areas that are outside of the floodway that development is allowed, but you would be held to standards such as flood proofing and things like that to make sure that your structure is sound. The FEMA floodway is the area usually in and around the stream with the black diagonal hatch that development is not allowed unless it's for special cases such as you have a fish habitat restoration project, or you have a culvert or bridge, things that have to occur in and around the stream itself, a bank protection project, those types of things. And when you do work in that area, the minimum standard, national standard, is that you can have no rise. So if you build a project, you can't cause any additional rise in the floodway. And then the floodplain is the combination of the two. So the flood fringe plus the FEMA floodway. That covers the whole entirety of the map there. And these are all based on the 1% annual exceedance probability flood, i.e. the 100-year flood. We talked before that you can't equate 100 with 1 in 100 years. It's actually just a 1% chance of occurring this year. So that's how the map is drawn. The additional standard, just for interest's sake, if you go to the next slide, is that King County and the city of Kenmore have what's called a zero-rise floodway, and this is the area shown in blue. It lies outside of the FEMA floodway, and that area in blue is you are not allowed to develop and cause any rise within that floodway. So similar to the FEMA floodway, how that works is that you can develop out in the flood fringe, and it will allow a rise of a foot. If you develop the entire flood fringe, if you just filled it all in, then that floodway would rise a foot. But if you develop in these areas that are in blue, it's going to have a rise of some sort, and the city and county codes do not allow that rise in these areas in blue. And these are just schematic representations. They're not actually mapped by FEMA or by the city. So if somebody wanted to develop in these areas, they would have to perform these studies on their own and bring them to the city and demonstrate the impacts of their development. So that's just a little bit of background. This came up during our definitions review, that there was some conflict, and we were sorting it out. And so by having this schematic and a whiteboard session, we were able to explain the definitions a little better, and then roll those into the code updates. That's all I have. Nothing to add beyond that. If you have any questions.
Questions for Dave? Okay, I have a question. Looking at this map, is there a distinction for the Zone X fields that appear to be in a lighter color than I see in the legend?
Well, so Zone X is usually shallow flooding, and the definitions are in the FEMA guidelines, so we can confirm that. And this is this area, so you also see a Zone A up in the upper right-hand portion. That's an approximate area. So the difference being a Zone AE, where we have contours, you can kind of see the wiggly line. That's a flood water elevation. There's a model that FEMA and the county have, and they've calculated what those flood elevations are. Zone A, it's just approximate. There's no study there, so they have best professional judgment in where the floodplain boundaries are. And then on Zone X, it's shallow flooding, and then they just characterize it as shallow flooding. They say it's not subject to the requirements of AE. It's just shallow flood areas that can occur. Others?
So you have, we have FEMA floodways, we have zero-rise floodways, flood fringe, flood hazard areas, floodplain, flood protecting elevation, base flood, and maybe I appreciate your explanations. I think they're very clear, but I found them a little confusing, and I'm just wondering, this nomenclature that we use, is there any way to simplify it for people like me, or is it only matter that the city staff and consultants and developers can kind of, instantly see these and kind of understand what each geographic area is and what it means?
No, I agree with you. It is.
I just, your explanations were great, and the written material was good, but it takes a little while to kind of figure it out.
It's specialized. I would say that we did go through the process of trying to streamline and simplify the definitions because there were conflicts, and it was too much information, just boil it down. We looked at other examples from King County and Pierce County, who are leaders in the region for developing those types of definitions. I will say, though, that just even on this slide, the term of zero-rise floodway versus zero-rise flood fringe, to me, it makes a little bit of a difference in that the floodway, I kind of think of it as being near the stream, but if it's zero-rise and it goes almost all the way out to the full extent of the floodplain boundary, then I think it's easier to describe it as the zero-rise flood fringe, because it's way out on the edges. So maybe little things like that might help. But these are the common terms and that FEMA uses that is standard throughout the industry, and so it means something, and it's got legal ramifications, and so that's how we need to use that terminology.
Gotcha, okay, yeah, I certainly appreciate that. And I see why we need distinctions between each zone, that makes, of course, perfect sense, so. Okay, well, if this is what people use, and that's, there's legal ramifications, that's what we go with then.
Well, and I will say that the city code is pretty streamlined and efficient in that way.
Is
So
it?
I was, save a few conflicts and things that need to get sorted out. There's other codes that are much more complicated to
Okay.
interpret.
Good, we're on the right path there, okay. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
I think if you had sections that you were uncomfortable with or that you wanted to talk more about, rather than going amendment by amendment, that would be the recommendation. All right. Okay, so the next set of, thank you. The next set of regulations are related to groundwater. You may recall that there was, we talked about this when we were talking about critical aquifer recharge areas, that we didn't appear to have any of those in Kenmore, but at the time of that discussion, there was some review of a map in Lake Forest Park that showed groundwater susceptibility, and that susceptibility to contamination. And the Planning Commission asked that a map be developed and standards be prepared to address groundwater susceptibility. So I had hoped to have the map tonight, but the map is still in draft. So when we have the map and have had a chance to review it, we want our surface water person to take a look at it. Then we will probably come back with tweaks with the map and tweaks to the regulations. But in the meantime, I wanted you to see this because this is a brand new section. And then if you have comments or questions or concerns, we could have those in mind as we move to the next step.
Any comments, questions, or concerns? Once. Yes, Vice Chair, please.
Let's see here. Let's see, what page is this? Page, excuse me, page 4. So yeah, there's a lot of good plans and precautions here about, groundwater contamination. And I guess I was wondering, it wasn't quite clear from this, what's the feedback loop with the city, if any, if there is an incident of groundwater contamination? I mean, it describes, again, a lot of good plans and precautions and things of that nature, but I was just wondering what happens if there is a contamination, and I don't know if that's even, part of this element here, but wanted to kind of
Right.
learn more about that.
So I think if they had violated one of the standards that's listed here, then it would be a code enforcement action.
Code enforcement.
Right. If things had progressed historically or for whatever reason to serious groundwater contamination, the Department of Ecology would be the governing agency. But these are presumably land use actions that we could set out some standards, and if someone wasn't meeting those standards, then we would, if there were a complaint, it's typically a complaint, then we would go to them and say, hey, you don't have your, you didn't do your method of storing that you had agreed to, or whatever.
So how would you find that out? Just they would have to self-report it, or?
Well, code enforcement generally in the city is done on a complaint basis, but if the city is aware of something, then the city can take action, I think, without a complaint.
Anything else? Anybody else? All right. Looks like we're satisfied with that one.
Okay. Bridget, do you want to take down the, slide, just take down the screen? Yeah, we don't need it at the moment.
Guess not.
I think so, unless they. I'm being confusing for Bridget. So the next thing that we're going to be looking at is.
Or is that what you're looking for?
No, I'm fine. That's all right. So the next item we're going to look at is the comprehensive plan shoreline sub-element. So this is part of the comprehensive plan, and again, this is the policy document that would be the foundation for changes to the shoreline regulations. And the shoreline sub-element is part of the shoreline master program. So the comp plan changes and the regs go together to make up the shoreline master program. So this element, as we've discussed before, can be amended outside of the once per year amendment restriction. So this will go forward in the spring, even though later in the year there'll be another comprehensive plan amendment process. To just touch on some of the significant amendments in the element before we turn to questions. I had 4 that I had called out particularly. One was having to do with the environment called the urban conservancy environment. And that environment, as you know, the 200-foot shoreline jurisdiction is divided into what are called environments. They're like zones. Urban conservancy is the one that covers, for example, Log Boom Park and Rhododendron Park. So what we have tried to do when we are looking at the urban conservancy environment, we're trying to provide more support in the policy language related to public parks, so that it's clear that that is an environmental designation that's appropriate for public access to the water and public enjoyment of the water. We'll be bringing back a revised shoreline map showing these environments, and we expect to recommend that the portions of Squires Landing Park that are proposed for development of water access facilities, that those be converted to urban conservancy versus natural, which is what they are currently. The second thing I wanted to call out is that we've made several amendments throughout the element talking about the source of trails information. Where are these trails identified? So we've called out the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan. We've called out the Downtown Plan, so that we know what documents we go to when we're looking at trail information. The third thing is that in several sections, and I have the page numbers here, but we eliminated quite a bit of text that really was more regulatory in nature. So the plan is supposed to be a higher level, broader document that sets a policy foundation for the very specific regulations. And there was, in several places, there were very detailed discussions of how these areas should be regulated, and that really falls more appropriately in the regulations. So we eliminated that. And then lastly, we made a prohibition on heavy manufacturing and industrial uses in the shoreline very clear. In the previous iteration, it wasn't quite so clear. So we wanted to make sure that, the zoning already prohibits those uses, but we wanted to clarify that in the shoreline as well, heavy manufacturing or industrial uses were not appropriate. So those were the highlights from my perspective, and you may have questions and comments. There are grandfathering provisions, but I believe that those have been, do you know whether those amendments were made? another department was taking on amendments to tighten up the grandfathering regulations relative to heavy manufacturing and industrial uses. That's something that I think the city council has been very clear that they do not want those uses on the shoreline. So there have been a series of actions to make that a less desirable use. Right, that the cement plant is one, and then the asphalt plant that's next to the cement plant, and then some of the uses that in the past have been on the Lake Point site have been heavy manufacturing or considered industrial. Yeah, plywood supply does not fit into that category. Plywood supply would be more of a construction and trade kind of, or a wholesaler. Maybe it would even fall under wholesaling. No, they are not. Right, correct. Okay. All right, well, we are cooking through this agenda. All right, so the fourth item for tonight is the first set of the revised shoreline regulations. So these are the regulations that fall from the policies that you just looked at. And the bulk of this particular package has to do with definitions. So I wanted briefly to touch on how we handle definitions in the code. I thought that might be useful for now and for the future. But when we have a definition in the code, first of all, it has to be used somewhere in the text. So if there's a definition that is crossed out, typically it's because, although someone at some point defined that, it's not used in the code. So I went through and checked every definition, made sure that in fact it was used in the code, and then when it's found in the code, we italicize it. That's a new practice that we started several years ago that applicants and those administering the code find really useful, because you know if you see a term in italics that it is in fact a defined term in the code. So this first part, as I said, is primarily definitions. The other thing that we've done is to recognize that this time around we are incorporating our city's critical area rules into the Shoreline Master Program. In the beginning of this set of amendments, you saw a whole section that listed all these sections of 1855, which is critical areas, that were being adopted in. Now we're just saying the critical area rules are adopted in as our critical area rules for the shoreline code. We're not specifying specific subsections. Then the other thing that this does is to clarify the difference between some water access structures, docks, piers, floats, and ramps. And we've tried to now define those terms in a way that they can be used consistently through the rest of the regulations. And then we also changed that description of urban conservancy, as I mentioned, to make it more clear that public parks are an acceptable use in that environment designation. So, anything to add? So those were the highlights from our perspective, and you may have other issues or questions or concerns. Mm-hmm. Correct. Correct. Right. So it's used in different ways. If you have a float is a standalone thing that floats on the water. You can dive off of it, swim off of it. But if you have a float that's connected to the shoreline, then we consider it a dock, and you have to meet the dock standards. Is that? Correct, for purposes of the regulations. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think a ramp would have to lead somewhere, so to a dock typically, or a pier. But we were trying to make sure that we have docks and piers separately defined and very clear, because Lake Washington typically has the pier sort of overwater access structure, and it's got very specific regulations related to piles and those types of things. And then on the Sammamish River, more traditionally, you end up with docks, which typically are composed of a float with a ramp connecting it to the shoreline. And so we have specific, and you'll see this when we provide the next section of regulations, but there are standards for the float component and the ramp component comprising the dock, and then there's specific regulations for pile-supported piers as well. So you'll see that in the regs, why we needed to kind of define each of those things, because they have some specific rules for each of them related to dimensions or materials and that sort of thing. Oh, boat launch.
No, I think there's a definition for boat launch. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. We can pull that out and take a look. And they're in alphabetically. Is there not one?
Separate one for launch.
Well, maybe that is something we need to add, a launch.
Yeah.
Somewhere it's described. I can't remember.
And it might be in the regulations themselves where it says a launch is blah, blah, blah. Right, but then doesn't define them. Yeah.
Right. I think that would be a good addition
Yeah.
to, okay, so add definition of launch. If the,
Great.
no, in terms of the definitional changes, or this first set, no. We did not anticipate sending that to all the property owners. As we get the full package of amendments, then that is something that, we'll send to our mailing list. There'll be a public hearing, advertising about the public hearing and that kind of thing. And then we had the focus group on the Sammamish River dock standards specifically, because those seemed most likely to be changed.
And I think in general too, so as part of that focus group, we did have a shoreline contractor, and we invited 3 different ones, and only one accepted, and he provided, I think, really good representation in general of shoreline property owners. And also in general, and we spoke about this very early on, I think that the standards that are provided in the Shoreline Master Program currently are really only suitable for those pier type overwater structures that you find on Lake Washington. So they don't really have anything at all that would work very well for them currently. So this definitely, I think, advances and is consistent generally with what is developed and has been developed on the river. So even though maybe they haven't been reached out to specifically, I think everything we're doing syncs up very nicely with what they would be allowed to do per state and federal regulations, and as well with what they are doing according to the contractor that does a lot of work on the river.
So there are a couple places where the project is being advertised. We have a web page that's dedicated to the project. When we did the open house, we did a lot of advertising about the open house to encourage people to get involved in the project. So we have a list of names who are specifically interested in following the project. And then, as Amy said, the person, the one contractor who came to the focus groups is a person who works for a lot of people on the river and probably in Lake Washington as well. So presumably, he is letting his clients know about the changes, and we have information at the permit counter to let folks who come in know that that this project is going on. It's much bigger than the dock and shoreline issues. As you know, it also affects wetlands and streams and that kind of thing.
And I do remember that we had a number of Sammamish River waterfront residents, I think, that showed up to the open house and participated and asked questions. And that was before we had these detailed regs in front of you, but so they should be on the list, and I'm assuming that they'll be connecting with their neighbors as well, too. Just on 75.
Right. What about the pedestrian bridge over, I guess that's Swamp Creek as well? We're going through our mind.
We're
like-
kind of going through our minds here. I think this is
Swamp Creek, we're
crossings of
thinking
Swamp
of-
Creek, but you're asking for crossings of the Sammamish River.
In Kenmore. Right.
Yes. I think I know what you mean.
They're addressed in the regulations. So when we bring forward the next set, there is language about bridges and how bridges should be handled. Okay, so I will make it a task to find out where all the bridges. Okay, so where Sammamish River and the Swamp Creek bridges are.
To go backwards in time? Can we do that?
Yes,
Can we? Yeah, I got confused as to which my questions were.
We're moving quickly.
Okay, well, I'll take the next hour and a half on these three. I yield the chair. Okay. Okay, first of all, on, let's see, it's 4E23. It has to do with aquaculture. No, this is in the prior, and I apologize for not bringing these up while I got a little confused where we were, I'm sorry. It's in the shoreline sub-element, correct. It's 23.3, okay. I guess I was curious, are there any current or proposed aquaculture facilities here in Kenmore or anywhere on Lake Washington? I know they can be kind of controversial. I just wasn't sure if that was a thing.
No. There are not. And
Okay.
I will tell you that our consultant said, why do you have all these policies in here related to aquaculture when there is no aquaculture?
Or anybody's knocking on the door asking about it?
No,
or-
and we just decided for, I don't know, safety's sake, I don't know, we just left it in. But we know of no proposal.
There, at least 6 years ago, 8 years ago, and probably it still is, aquaculture was a really a topic of interest intensively by the state and the tribes. And so there was a whole lot of back and forth, and there were a number of jurisdictions that tried just prohibiting it outright because they didn't have it, it didn't seem like it would fit in the community, so on and so forth. And it turned out after a bunch of back and forth that folks are not allowed to do that. And so I think now in your current regulations, in the regulations section, it says that as a conditional use, you can have aquaculture in the aquatic environment. And then I think there's one regulation about that. But I think for safety's sake is kind of maybe a good point, just because it's a very intense, hotly debated topic of aquaculture and the potential in the future maybe for more need for aquaculture facilities given the current status of salmonids and everything that the tribes and the state and everyone else are trying to do in terms of recovering species. So who knows about what the future might bring, and maybe there could be, but right now there certainly isn't.
Are there any elsewhere in Lake Washington that you know of?
Not that I'm aware of. I think
Okay.
there's like up in Issaquah, there's that fish hatchery. I can't think of any others. I think there's some on the Cedar River, so tributaries of Lake Washington, but not on Lake Washington or any of the North Lake Washington tribs.
Okay. All right, thank you. And then the next question I had was on page 4E26. And it has to do with the one right above commercial about marinas allowing, marinas should be allowed to have live-aboard tenants with some conditions. So is that basically up to the marina, if they meet those conditions, whether to allow that or not? I mean,
Yeah, it would be up to the marina, except that the one marina, you'll see that there was this note about the underlying zoning restriction, the P suffix.
Yeah,
The P suffix that dealt with liveaboards has gone away because the permit that approved the marina affected by the P suffix had a covenant, a restriction as part of their operation that said no liveaboards. So the marina itself was regulating that there not be liveaboards, but we felt that if the marina wanted to change their covenant, they could do that, and then the city would sort of step out of the role of determining whether or not liveaboards should be permitted as long as the standards were met. And there are more standards. Again, this is the policy basis, but there are
Right.
standards in the regulations.
what are the nature of those standards? I mean, you mentioned adequate, land and pump out facilities. I mean,
Right. So, and I think there may be standards about tenure. I can't quite remember. Do you remember what they are?
I think it might not be much more than basically what you see here. I can't remember if there were any others
Yeah. on that.
either. Yeah, I'll have to look again. Oh, I can actually look it up.
I don't think we know off the top
Okay,
of our
that's all
head.
I guess I was
But
wondering,
the
if, is
regulations
this a
will-
big thing? Are there many liveaboards there? Is it a legitimate sort of housing supply? Are these sort of temporary
Yeah, I'm
living
not.
arrangements? I guess I'm kind of, I know there's another section that said no houseboats, so I know that's not,
Right.
a thing here in
Right.
Kenmore. But
So I want to say that one of the standards is, but for single-family use only, located in a marina that provides shower and toilet facilities, and there's no sewage discharges. Again, the 10% limitation, they are owner-occupied vessels, so no renting. And there are onshore support services in proximity to the liveaboards. So the idea that if you're living on the boat, that your services are provided by the marina, in the marina, and that you are the owner of the boat choosing to live there.
So it's not a large scale,
No.
large number of people that gets more
No.
scrutiny.
And I really think that the marina where this came up does not permit liveaboards. I still think they have a covenant. Now, there are two marinas down there, I think, but one for sure, I think, still has the covenant that doesn't permit it.
Okay. And my final thing was just a kind of a general question about Lake Point. The proposed Lake Point development obviously is covered here, right, under the shoreline sub-element, even though that would be a separate, I guess, development agreement?
So the shoreline rules, the jurisdiction is 200 feet or out to the edge of wetlands if they're associated wetlands. So those rules do apply, and in fact, they would have to get a shoreline permit to do a development if they were impacting that jurisdiction. So they do apply to Lake Point.
And did that ever come up in the Widener discussions?
They knew very well that
Okay.
that would be a
Was it
requirement.
an issue, any of the particular, regulations or policies? I know there were a lot of other issues from
Right.
what the,
There was
the
some
city said.
very preliminary discussion about it, but as you know, that project has suspended discussions,
right,
so.
okay. But it wasn't a sticking point or anything that we could look at in terms of
I don't have
these
information that it
regulations?
was,
Yeah.
right? And certainly the reviewers who were looking at the regulations had that project in mind.
Right.
When we, and in fact, Chair Nugent will remember when we did the shoreline master program last time around, many of the regulations were carefully crafted to be compatible with the permit that had been approved years ago on that property.
For Lake Point, okay.
Right, correct.
I
Okay.
think Lake Point, the owner of Lake Point had sent his attorney
Mm-hmm, right,
to confirm that he had hired and sent an attorney.
Okay,
right,
yeah.
right.
Okay. I'm good, thank you.
Yeah, thank
Didn't
you,
take an hour and a
Vice
half,
Chair.
didn't take an hour and a half, so.
Well done. So, any other commissioners have questions or comments regarding either attachment 4 or any prior attachments? Yes, Commissioner Olson.
The discussion of single-family boating was a little concerning to me, because oftentimes, if it's a sailboat, you may have friends who will join you on that boat. But I wasn't clear whether you had to be, is this in any given 24-hour period, or, because a lot of marinas will have boats visit, and they will have the ability to be there. So I'm not sure whether
Right.
the other definitions confuse it a little bit.
Liveaboard is a defined term, so we certainly could look at that. Let me get to the definition. And we'll see what it says. Okay. Liveaboard means a licensed vessel that is used as a primary residence. So I think you'd have to assume that primary residence is more than a one night, overnight. I mean, you would physically have to be living on the boat.
Some other communities, SMPs that I've worked on over the years, like in Chelan, where this is a little more common, they've taken steps to define that further, because that question came up, like, is it 29 days or 31 days? Is it 72 hours? So those are things that could be defined if you wanted to, and I don't think there's any state standard or guidance other than primary residence and whatever that means to you.
The only reason I'm asking about that is I do have a friend who has a boat, and what he does is he goes up and down the coast. And so I'm a little concerned, I don't want to preclude if that's an activity that a number of boaters use. So I'm not sure we've fully defined what makes the most sense there.
Does he have a residence?
He rents them out, but he really stays on the boat.
So he lives on the boat?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So if the rest of the commission is wanting to tighten up the, the term, right, we certainly could look at some other standards, other places, and try to,
And so you're just interested in, right now, liveaboards are allowed in marinas, but you're thinking just like pulling up at a friend's dock and staying for a week and visiting, and
Yeah.
that is sort of a very temporary basis guest kind of status.
Yes, but it was going into the definitions of single-family, primary. I
Right.
just wanted to make sure that we weren't, they're too limiting, that's all. But if you end up with days or something, then at least you've got a very clear standard. I don't know if we need a motion so much as they said they were gonna take a look at other marinas and standards. Yeah. I would be interested to make sure we're not over-regulating.
Right, so let's try to get, if we have a majority that want to do that, let's try to get it passed. Also, it sounds like you want to.
I was really after them doing a connecting with other marinas to make sure that that we're following a standard procedure in their definitions that way.
I just think it's not a problem, but it's out there that people know about, why mess with it? Is it, having a little bit in the bag is okay, because the marina is the one that's gonna, they're the ones that they can say, okay, you're violating the bylaws here, you're Uncle Frank, not only is he a drunk and making lots of noise, he's not senior resident, so I think that I would leave it to the
Have our own regulation, our own definition
yeah,
specifically.
yeah, and a residence, you gotta be, your residence, I think that's perfect, I think it's great, as it stands, just.
Yes, one no. Commissioner Baker?
I just have a question for clarification. I thought you said that the covenants of the marina currently do not allow liveaboards. Is that correct?
I think that is true for one of the marinas.
Okay. So does it, okay, that answers my question.
Any other? Like to comment on whether we should further define?
Could I just clarify? I think you said that if someone wants to go up to their friend's dock currently and stay for a few days, is there any prohibition on that as the regulations are written now?
Well, I would not define that as a primary residence.
So
I mean-
primary residence is really the criteria that we're looking at.
Yeah, what I've been a little confused about it, Commissioner Olson's describing a scenario where somebody does have, is what is his primary residence?
Right.
So if the definition of liveaboard is you can't occupy your boat as your primary residence in our shoreline jurisdiction,
Except
then
in a
what
marina.
night violates the liveaboard threshold for that person?
Right.
And what you're getting at is there should be more tolerance for that. So,
But it's broader than that, because I think the liveaboard is restricted to a marina. So it's not just the,
regulation restricts its reference to liveaboard to those marinas.
I believe so. And so that would be the question of not only the time, but the location.
So, somebody living on a or her boat as their primary residence, go to a non-marina location, private dock,
Right.
and occupy that dock for as long as they want.
I don't think so, because it doesn't say it's in the
I
marina.
think that's true, and I think probably the issue that would come up would be how are they handling waste and all those types of things that happen on liveaboards, and presumably they mosey on over to a marina and then go to a pump out station and that sort of thing. So I think it would only be an issue if there were maybe a neighbor complaint, if there's like a view issue, which could happen depending on the size of the boats, or if there's some sort of a water quality violation, then that might prompt an issue as well. I would
Yeah.
assume. Right, not the boat itself.
Do you have those standards? Oh, yeah. I want to look at the standards again, because I think doesn't it say it's only allowable in a marina?
Private property, yeah.
Yeah, you can only have liveaboards if they are located in a marina. So.
Nobody outside the marina can live.
Correct,
Within
the
the
way it's
shoreline,
currently written. So if you had a boat that you were living on, that's why I was saying it's not just an issue of how long, but also where.
Right, and I wasn't sure where
Yeah,
what tolerance was. So
Yeah.
In the marina only or outside?
yeah, well, the standard
In
is,
the marina, can you have liveaboard? One marina says no,
right,
or potentially one marina where any liveaboard could spend the night.
right.
Find the extent to which the city allows that marina to let somebody.
I think the question is more the private dock question. if you have a liveaboard, you have somebody who lives on their boat, like Dennis's friends, and he wants to go visit his best buddy and dock at their, I think there is room for a standard there, for sure.
Right, I think they're both on the table.
Yeah.
This regulation might apply to both. So I think that's what you're getting at, right, Dennis? You want more tolerance for somebody to be able to, outside a marina, stay at a dock as their primary residence.
Yes.
Anybody else? For guidance?
Right. I thought Harbor Village was the one that had the covenant that prevented it, unless they took that off. They used to. Okay, so that has changed then, since we last looked at it.
Maybe I'm missing something here, but it seems like maybe what you mean is absence of a marina standard. Five. Are, to my knowledge, most of the larger marinas do primary living. And don't necessarily have a definition of family only.
Okay. So, yeah, well, I think I see where you're going here, Dennis. You want to limit this expanded specific definition to non-marina slips, right? Docks.
I was talking about marina because I am really confused now.
I thought you said we'll leave the marinas to decide for themselves.
But
And then
that
the
would
city
be
makes.
the language that needs to be.
Right,
Yes,
right, as part of
Yes.
your proposal.
yes.
The marinas would decide for themselves. Non-marina docks, slips would be subject to a city standard, which is blank, right? I think what
Yes,
you're saying
okay.
is that you'd like the staff to look at what other cities allow, come back to us and propose it. Or inform us, and then we would decide if that's a standard we want to adopt.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah, we have boating regulations, and at some point, we don't have jurisdiction. So there are boating regulations in a totally different section of the municipal code that would tackle something like that. Okay.
It's outside the city, yeah. It's out,
So that's off our table.
Yeah.
So does anybody else want to respond to Commissioner Olson's proposal that staff look into limits on tolerance for another city's?
outside of
Outside
marinas.
marinas.
Yeah, I'd be up for seeing language to that effect and considering it.
the only question I have is, do we have a directional factor on this? Are we proposing something in favor of, or?
I think we're asking them to give us information. What other cities allow? They tell us, and we decide if that's what we want to do.
So we don't have directional guidance at this point, we just want to see what the other cities are doing, and then we'll have
we
an
have a
opinion.
proposal for how long we think somebody should be able
Well-
to live with Dr. primary residence vote?
I have no idea if I have no idea collectively what we're thinking, if it's yes, no.
I think I would like to know what other cities do.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it has a bearing on what people expect. Going up and down waterways around here, I'd like to be probably with what other cities do, so they have reasonable.
Would you limit those to fresh water bodies, or,
It's only our shoreline jurisdiction, that's all we can govern here.
okay. Kirkland would be a good,
Yeah,
Yeah, the Lake Washington cities, right?
right.
Right. Yeah, yeah, I think it's a good topic. I mean, it certainly can be controversial if someone were to pull a boat up and be living there on their private dock and blocking the view of the neighbors. That could be a problem. We'll find out. I think, yes, we're gonna check it out. We're gonna bring back some information. Sure.
Any other questions or comments about what staff has proposed on any of these? Satisfied with the rest?
Okay. All right, so the next batch that we anticipate bringing forward to you for your December 4 meeting are the geologically hazardous area rules. You gave us policy direction at the last meeting, and so we've tried to write amendments that reflect that policy direction. And then we'll have the next set of shoreline regulations as far as we can go, but I'm sure that it will include permitted uses in the shoreline jurisdictions, and we're converting again to our standard list of land uses, so it's going to look very different from the current set of shoreline regulations. And then we may also have the groundwater map and regs. We'll have to see about that. Groundwater susceptibility. Groundwater susceptibility. So, so the state, as you know, Commerce in conjunction with some other organizations puts on a planning short course. It's kind of an intensive background training for planning commissioners and planning staff. And they have offered to do one in Kenmore. So they do it all over the state. But we had asked about their interest in doing one in Kenmore. And so they had asked us to propose 3 separate dates that might work. So I assume that we're looking at January. And so I guess the first question would be whether you would want to do that on a meeting night that takes up a meeting that we could use for critical areas, or what your sort of gauge the level of interest. Who should we be polling to see availability? Well, it could be January or February. I don't know that they just said give us 3 dates and we'll try to work that in. And then of course they invite people from all over the area. So it wouldn't just be Kenmore planning commissioners or staff. It would be a lot of people that would be invited.
you want to speak to that?
I don't mean to skip ahead, I was just
Yeah.
thinking in terms of timing for training, it would be, and I don't know what the start date is for any new commissioners joining the panel, but
Yeah.
What, so the council formally reappointed the Commissioner Van der Linde, Horenshaw, and Olson last night to serve another 3-year term, and that term would start January 1st. As Commissioner Nugent is not interested in serving another term, then there is one vacancy. So we have put out a call for applications, and I think we have 8 applicants. So the council then is interested in interviewing those applicants and then making a selection for somebody to start. So there'll be one new commissioner, and then the rest then would be a pool. Then, as you know, if vacancies come up midterm or whatever, then we have kind of a pool of candidates to call from. So that's what I can tell you on.
Just out of curiosity, did they decide any of the other things they were considering? Like, if you serve 2 terms, then you cannot continue?
They asked that we had 4 questions. The first one, now you're asking me to remember this off the top of my head. We'll see if I can do it. The first question, so at the time, the council, we looked at all different jurisdictions. We looked at all of our neighbors to bring forward ideas from other jurisdictions to see if they wanted to change any of the standards in, I think it's Municipal Code Section 3 or something about planning commissioners. So they asked that we amend the section that said geographic representation was important to also say demographic representation. It's not a deciding factor, but at least to consider that. So that was one thing. They did not want to do term limits, which many jurisdictions do, so they declined that. They did put a restriction on service as the chair, so I think it was like 3 out of 4 years, and they talked about that in terms of allowing others on the commission to have that experience, I guess. And then there was the 4th question, which was escaping me at the moment. Oh, I know. It was who should be eligible to serve on the planning commission. So the city's rules say residents. Other places say business owners or property owners or even employees. One jurisdiction allows employees. And they said no, that they only wanted residents to serve. So those, I think, were the 4 questions.
Those were the questions, and that was a response. So given the council's direction, then we would bring back code amendments next year.
Right. Thank you.
So we're looking for dates, presumably in January. I think Lori's first question was, do you want to do it on the night of a regularly scheduled meeting or another night?
How long is the training?
At least a couple of hours, I think.
Right. I'd say 2 to 3 hours. So if you did it on your meeting night, that's really your meeting.
We're looking Are we under a, time crunch in January? How important are the meetings regularly scheduled to get through the critical areas? And
I would say that I think we are hoping that we might be able to hold the hearing in January, maybe the 2nd meeting of January. So, I mean, I can't answer the question. So if you wanted to take one meeting out of January and February, I mean, that certainly is a possibility, and we can work around that. But I can't answer how long it will take because I don't know how far we're going to get in the next few meetings.
well, maybe we should think about February, since we might need that first week in January to clean everything up for the public hearing, which may be the 2nd meeting in January, maybe February. That would give our new commissioner time to develop some bad habits that we can share.
So February, do you have an interest in doing it on a meeting night? It sounds like maybe that's where you're headed if you,
Not necessarily, I'm open other nights as well. I was just thinking, it sounds like if we're targeting a potential public hearing in January, that would be
yeah.
better to leave that month for getting our work done. And I don't have a preference for meeting night versus non-meeting night.
Any other?
I'd probably go for meeting night. I guess it might also depend on who people are coming from, how far away from other commissions. I mean, is it, are these normally held? I think the one I went to was at UW. I don't know, maybe some of you guys, some of you remember that. I think it was in the afternoon. Remember that, Doug?
Yeah, I've been to 3 of them.
Even at 3 of them, okay.
And
Yeah.
one was in Linwood, I think. County.
Okay, yeah.
And the one in Dub, I'm not sure, that was a pretty big crowd.
Yeah, it was pretty big, yeah.
More.
This might be extensive, but could we do it, I don't know, what's convenient for other, I guess I'm thinking more of other people, not just us, if it is gonna be a regional event, maybe we don't know how far away they're coming
But I don't
from,
think
or,
whether it's our meeting night or not, I don't think that's gonna have a bearing on convenience, unless they happen to have meetings that night too.
Yeah.
We would be guessing.
Would
Whether
be,
commissions
yeah.
have meetings. First question would be, if we have, I think, if the new commission next year has room in its schedule to do it on a meeting night, then that makes sense.
right, and location, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Do we avoid the public meetings act if all of us get together for training at the same time?
Just don't talk about.
Don't talk about
commission
business.
We can all hang out.
So.
Yeah, I would advocate, a meeting night then, yeah.
All right, so that leaves 2 nights, one of the 2 Tuesdays in February, right?
So I think we'll
There's 2
propose
nights. We want
those.
3 days, right?
I think we can propose 2. I don't know.
I think 2 out of 3. They just want to try and get this on the calendar so that they can, start advertising and getting the word out. So we'll let them know.
All right. Satisfied item 3B.
It's a different subject. So I don't know, Bridget, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yes, I just have a few commissioners that need to fulfill this. I thought I'd just bring it up. There is an open government training session on November 28th up at the East Sound on Orcas Island. I'm not sure I think I forwarded you guys this. I'm not sure if I did or not, but I'd be more than happy if those who have not taken it would want to take that course. If not, there is also a webinar that it's easy to take. So, and if you don't know if you've taken it or not, I can let you know. No, I mean, it's just an announcement. It is something that is required. So if you haven't fulfilled it, then it does need to be done. But I can give you some options out there, which best suits your time frame and needs.
So if you don't know who you are, Bridget will probably contact you and let you know who you are. But it is important. We have a responsibility. It's state law now that you have to have that training. And so we need to be able to document that the training has occurred.